Boa tarde, né? Sejam bem-vindos ao segundo ciclo da Escola de Altos Estudos, Crianças e Adolescentes em Situação de Risco, Dimensões Éticas, Intervenção e Inovação Científica. Eu sou Débora Holanda, coordenadora do PPG-Psi, e antes da gente começar, eu preciso fazer alguns agradecimentos. Esse evento é uma proposta conjunta que envolve pesquisadores de diferentes centros de pesquisa no país e que foi liderada por um grupo de docentes do PPG-Psi, do PPGS e da UFSCar. Então, fazem parte da nossa equipe, né? A professora Lídia Postali, do PPGS, o professor Nassim Chamel Elisa, a professora Lisa Barham, o professor Alex Pessoa. Eu queria também fazer um agradecimento especial aos nossos alunos da pós-graduação, são muitos, eu não vou nomear todos, mas que têm nos ajudado desde o começo da escola, né, desde o primeiro ciclo aí com a visita da Linda Liembenberg. Então, em nome da equipe, eu agradeço muito o apoio, né, de todos esses alunos que têm nos ajudado na comissão organizadora, as secretarias do PPG-Psi e do PPGS, a Eliane, o Juan e os estagiários. Agradecemos os nossos parceiros, né, da USP, Instituto Pense, o UERJ, Universo, Federal Fluminense, né, e aos dois INCTs que também estão envolvidos nessa proposta, o INCT-ET, coordenado pela professora Daisy, e o Instituto Nacional de Psiquiatria do Desenvolvimento para Crianças e Adolescentes, coordenado pelo professor Eurípides, da USP São Paulo. Nós agradecemos também o apoio da ProPG e da equipe, né, do Eduardo Martins, responsável pelo belo trabalho de divulgação desse evento. Sobretudo, agradecemos a CAPES pelo apoio financeiro, pelo investimento nesse excelente programa que é a Escola de Altos Estudos. Acho que todos aqui já devem saber que nós vamos ter tradução simultânea, que vai ser realizada pela empresa Prisma Traduções. E aí eles me pedem para fazer um lembrete importante para vocês, né, que ao término da conferência, que por favor devolvam os aparelhos, né? A empresa está sediada em São Paulo, então vocês vão ter uma longa jornada para devolver o aparelho, se vocês esquecerem na bolsa, tá? Então, por favor, é só, né, esse lembrete importante. Eu queria também fazer dar um outro aviso para vocês, que esse também é um aviso importante. A professora Ilina pediu para informar que alguns dos dados que ela vai apresentar aqui ainda não foram publicados, então ela pede encarecidamente que vocês não divulguem, não tirem fotos e divulguem nas mídias sociais, Twitter, Facebook, tá? Isso é super importante. Bom, então é com muita alegria e satisfação que eu apresento a nossa convidada especial desse nosso segundo ciclo, a doutora Ilina Singh. A doutora Ilina Singh é professora de Neurociência e Sociedade na Universidade de Oxford, onde realiza uma consulta conjunta entre o Departamento de Psiquiatria, a Faculdade de Filosofia, Centro de Oxford para Neuroética e Centro Uehiro. Seu trabalho examina as implicações psicossociais e éticas dos avanços da biomedicina e da neurociência para jovens e famílias, né, e reflete um compromisso de longa data de levar as experiências de primeira pessoa de crianças e jovens à avaliação ética, tomada de decisão clínica e formulação de políticas. Projetos recentes incluem o projeto ADHD Voices, né? Neuro Enhancement Responsible Research and Innovation e o Urban Brain Project. Em 2014, a professora Ilina recebeu um prêmio Wellcome Trust Senior Investigator Award por um estudo intitulado Tornar-se Bom, Intervenção Precoce e Desenvolvimento Moral na Psiquiatria Infantil. Ilina contribuiu para vários grupos científicos e políticos, incluindo os Institutos Nacionais de Excelência Clínica do Reino Unido, o Instituto Nacional de Saúde Mental dos Estados Unidos e o Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Ela é co-presidente do Conselho Consultivo de Ética do projeto EU Aims, sobre tratamentos para o autismo e consultora especialista do National Autism Project. A sua conferência de hoje é intitulada Ferramentas Digitais na Saúde Mental, Considerações Éticas e Sociais. Então, com vocês, a doutora Ilina Singh.
Okay, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. If I find that I'm turning always away from you, then I will go and stand where my slides are so that I can see them better. So let me first say thank you very, very much, particularly to all of the colleagues here who've made this possible, and to the CAPES funding, to Gabriella Pavarini, who's now a postdoctoral fellow in my team in Oxford, but who has also been working to make this all possible. You've been so welcoming, and it's my first time in Brazil, and it's been absolutely fantastic, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about some work that came to my mind as we were doing some simultaneous projects. One of the projects is to think about digital mental health interventions for young people, so interventions that you can get on an app on your smartphone, for example. And at the same time, we were doing some work with young people who are in a program in England called the Early Intervention in Psychosis program. So this is a project that is funded by our National Health Service to try to capture young people, really from the ages of about 12 to 13 to up to the age of about 30, at a point when they've either had their first episode of psychosis or they seem to be at risk of having their first episode in psychosis. And this is a program that gets them help very quickly. It gives them CBT for psychosis. And the idea is, of course, that we might be able to prevent a future full-blown episode of psychosis. So those two projects were running simultaneously. And so I've put them together in this talk in a way that I hope makes some sense to you. So let me start with digital mental health. Probably it's as hot a subject here as it is in the UK. Everybody is saying that the digital platforms will change mental health for the future, and particularly that they will change mental health for the vast proportion of people in the world who don't have access to any mental health treatments. So this is a you probably can't see that because I can't see it, it's very blurry. So this was taken from Nature, the journal Nature, where they tried to do some quantification and illustration of the problem in global mental health. And so essentially, you know, as I said, you probably already are aware, a majority of people, even in the developed world, don't receive treatments for mental health challenges. And 75 to 85% of people living in the developing world received no treatment in the previous year. But a majority of those people living in the developing world have access to a smartphone. And so the thinking was, well, if we could deliver the service via a smartphone, if we can get apps for CBT, for psychosis or depression or what have you, this will change the face of mental health in the world. Now, I work in a big project across Africa, so I want to say, although I won't be able to say much more about it, I don't think it's that simple. Smartphones are probably not going to make all the difference in the world. They might be a start in how we deliver mental health treatment, but there are a lot of problems. In UK/American context, we can see about 78 companies that are currently starting to market these kinds of apps. And of course, one of the big problems is evidence. So very, very few of these apps have any good evidence behind them. I can see colleagues nodding in the audience. And part of the problem, of course, is that when you do clinical trials for pharmaceutical drugs, there's a lot of money in that. It costs a lot of money, costs hundreds and millions of pounds to get a drug to market. But then, of course, the pharmaceutical company makes that back by charging lots of money for that drug. The problem with an app is that it's supposed to be free to all, at least certain versions. And so the market model for these apps is not yet very good, which is part of the reason why we don't see them in robust clinical trials, the way that we have seen drugs come into robust clinical trials. And then there are also a variety of people who make these apps. So here on the board I have an app, for example, the True Colors app, which was actually created by researchers in Oxford, which has not yet been spun out in a company, but it's available to people who are part of the clinical environment in Oxford. Heard of Headspace? Okay. So that was created by really a couple of friends who were at the London School of Economics, and they took some mindfulness courses, and they said, oh, well, that sounds like something we want to make an app. And it just took off. So it didn't come out of a clinical space. It didn't come out of a research space. So they are now trying to catch up and do some research because they have so much data from Headspace users. So it's a very mixed bag, this digital mental health scene. And the other thing to say about digital mental health is that it comes in a variety of forms. So there's teletherapy platforms where you actually use the digital platform alongside a human therapist. There's AI assisted, so that might be a chatbot that pops up, or again, it might be an actual human person who is the chatbot who's giving the user feedback, or it might be a fully automated app. And that's an app where there is no human involved. There's an algorithm involved. And the algorithm is learning about the person as the person is using the app, and what we call personalizing itself to the user. And that, from an ethics perspective, is the most interesting for us, because that is then therapy delivered entirely by an algorithm. So that's what I'm going to come and talk to you about later on, is what are the ethical considerations when we turn to an algorithm to deliver therapy to human beings. So as I said, there is a big problem of evidence, and this is actually one of the few studies that is now currently out there where there is some clinical trial data on the use of this mobile phone app. And, again, it varies. I mean, the numbers tend to be quite small in these clinical trials. So although we have some evidence, I wouldn't say the evidence is particularly robust as yet. So that's part one of the talk, giving you a background to digital mental health and giving you some of that landscape. Now, in part two of the talk, I'm going to shift to talking to you about this empirical research that we did with young people who are in the early intervention in psychosis program in England. So we were funded, as part of this program, we were funded to do some work with the young people themselves to think about what are the ethical implications of delivering this service to young people. So as I said, the idea is to capture young people at a phase when they are not yet having a full-blown experience of psychosis. There are two groups in this population. One is called young people who are at risk mental state. So those are young people who haven't had a first episode of what we would recognize as psychosis yet, but they've had something that makes people think that possibly they're going to be at risk of psychosis. So they've become very angry, for example, and haven't been able to reorganize themselves in a rational way. Or they've exhibited a lot of severe conduct that is really inexplicable, or they've become suddenly very paranoid for a few days. Our services in the NHS are not fantastic, and so we have very long waiting lists for kids who are looking for mental health support, sometimes 6 months to a year. And if you have something that is as vague as, gosh, he got angry and nobody could really understand why he was angry, you're going to wait a lot longer than if you have a diagnosis. But of course, we all know that diagnosis is problematic, particularly in that early stage, particularly for children when they're 12 or 13 years old, because it could have been anything. So we want to be very careful about diagnosis. So some of those at-risk mental state kids who come into this service really shouldn't be in a service at all, but they're there. And similarly, what we know about people in this this long phase of adolescence, which we now see is going up to age 26 or more, who have what we recognize as a first episode of psychosis, is 50% of them will never go on to have psychosis. So for us, as people thinking about the ethics of these programs, it's actually quite important to think, well, what is the impact of putting somebody who may never have psychosis into a program that labels them with having a risk of psychosis? So that's where the ethics came from. So we did some largely qualitative work with these young people, and we ended up interviewing about 42 of them, and we also talked to some of the clinicians who were involved in delivering this service, and I won't talk about the clinician data today. I'm only going to talk about the young people who are the service users. And we did a one-time interview. We had different interviewers, so we were able to get some variability in that sense. And we used what is called a grounded theory approach in qualitative work, where you're not quite sure what you're going to find yet, but you can continue to develop your interview questionnaires alongside actually collecting your data. So when I started looking at this, so we have a team working on this project in Oxford, and when I started looking at this data, it sort of brought me back to when I was first doing my PhD. I did my PhD with somebody who was, with Professor Carol Gilligan. I don't know if anybody has heard of Professor Gilligan, but she sort of invented what we might think of today as feminist moral psychology. And as part of that, she made us read a lot of Sigmund Freud, which is old-fashioned now and was old-fashioned then, but she wanted us to read Freud. And so I realized, looking at this data, that I was more of a Freudian than I had thought, or at least I'm old enough now to be going back to my intellectual roots, because it was the reading of the data that really brought this digital mental health world and this world of these kids in this program together for me. But let me first tell you about our theoretical framework for this project. So we used a theoretical framework from someone called Alistair McIntyre, who created what we call virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is really this idea that in a secular society, it's very difficult to find where moral boundaries exist. If you don't have God to say, this is right and this is wrong and this is how you should act and this is how you should not act, where do you get your moral boundaries, your moral compass from? And McIntyre, who is actually a Catholic theologian as well as being a philosopher, said, well, what you get it from is an understanding of what Aristotle called character. And he went back and he looked at the ways in which Aristotle talked about developing character and living a virtuous life. And he really created a whole ethical framework around this understanding of being a virtuous person and being a person who has character. And in that, if you read McIntyre, he talks a lot about practice. And because we were very interested in the clinical practice that was around this early intervention in psychosis program, we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to think about McIntyre's practice and relate it to what it might be to be both a virtuous clinician in the early intervention program and a virtuous young person who is participating in this early intervention program. And so we were able to operationalize some of our data analysis around some of McIntyre's ideas, specifically his idea that we could view early intervention as a series of practices that developed these habits of character. And what were those habits of character? So what were those habits of thought and feeling and action that were exhibited in the encounter between the clinician and the young person in this program? So we asked as a research question, what is good practice in the context of early intervention service? What are the habits of thought, feeling, and action that inhere in the early intervention context? And what are the barriers to the cultivation and the expression of those habits? And then further on, we wanted to know, could we make a link between good practice in early intervention in psychosis and improved moral self-understanding? Because that, for McIntyre, was the key to character. If you had a virtuous and moral sense of self, you would be a person of character. And of course, we wanted to know whether moral self-understanding is related to experiences of recovery. I tend to believe that when we think about recovery, psychological recovery, we've stopped talking about the moral. And yet, in a career of talking to young people about what it means to them to be diagnosed with conditions like ADHD, to be diagnosed with conditions like autism, what comes back again and again is actually a notion that their sense of themselves as morally capable was disrupted. So kids with attention deficit disorder will say, I can't control how I act in a moment where I care about how I act. Or a person with autism will say, I don't feel empathy, I don't feel compassion, and I know that that's the right thing to feel. So for me, these are moral sensibilities. So it's really important for us to be thinking, are these moral sensibilities related to the experiences of recovery, particularly for young people who are having experiences in an early intervention psychosis program, which are more severe, actually, than the kids we see in an ADHD cohort or an autism cohort. I mean, some of these young people are actually experiencing hearing voices that are telling them to do criminal things, violent things. Some of them are experiencing deep self-doubt about whether they are good inside because of the kinds of experiences they're having, either from voice hearing or their paranoia. So these young people with psychosis really are, in a sense, morally very vulnerable, and their self-understanding morally is very vulnerable. So when we looked at the data, this is, we did see, as I suppose we expected, that negative moral self-understanding does have significant consequences for the potential for recovery. And so if you look at the self-descriptions on the left-hand side there, a lot of these young people would talk about feeling dark, feeling angry, feeling violent, feeling paranoid, having a sense of themselves as not quite real or not being really rooted in reality. And that led to these global self-evaluations of being a bad person, being evil, being inhuman, being crazy. So very stigmatizing self-evaluations. And then the cognitive behavioral consequences of those self-evaluations, again, would be quite severe. So feelings of isolation, being rejected by others, having suicidal thoughts, not being able to engage properly with people they loved, and having a lot of depression and anxiety. And we did again find that the early intervention in psychosis practices were linked with the development of what we considered to be moral mastery and improved positive moral self-understanding. And if you look around the circle, these were the sort of key ingredients that young people kept coming back to when they were talking about how we should understand this improved moral self-understanding, this sense of being a master of yourself morally. And it was the ability to be able, if not to show kindness and compassion, to recognize when others were showing it and to respond appropriately. To exhibit empathy, or at least to recognize empathy. The experience of talking and listening was also really important to them. Being talked to and being able to talk to others and also being listened to. And the process of re-socialization as well. So this was particularly important because a lot of these young people were quite isolated. And that, for them, led to this ability to know what was the real and what was not real, or at least to be able to ask for help when they were beginning to have difficulty distinguishing between the reality and the unreality. It led to a normalization of their experiences and also to a sense of themselves as a better person. So one thing that was really interesting about these findings, particularly the findings about being talked to and being listened to, was that there are two major services in the early intervention in psychosis program. One is CBT for psychosis, which is delivered with a therapist. And so the young people go to the clinic and they get their CBT at the clinic and then they go back home. But the other intervention is delivered by a mental health worker, who frankly in the UK context is a very undervalued role. It's very poorly paid. It's very poorly trained, usually about 6 months of training. These mental health workers in certain parts of our country sometimes travel up to 50 to 60 miles a day to visit these kids who are at home and isolated. And all they do is they knock on the door and they say to the young person, "I'm here, did you get dressed today? Have you eaten? Would you like to go for a walk? Would you like to go shopping?" And for the young people, the most important aspects of the people who were talking and listening and the people who were helping them feel re-socialized and normal were not the CBT for psychosis clinicians. They were those people who were knocking on their door and coming to see them. So it's a really important finding, actually, about sometimes how simple it is to help somebody who is having some really significant problems, and how we as people who think about, well, what can we deliver? Sometimes you don't have to think so very hard. So this is what this looks like in the data. I've started color coding my qualitative data because I don't like it when people only put up the best quote. But I recognize that many of us do that. So the data in the red is my best quote. The data in the blue and the purple are quotes that happened more frequently and are not as good, but they still make the point. So, talking and listening as good practice that supports moral self-understanding, this is the kind of thing that the young people told us about. Just being able to talk to the care worker whenever I want. Just being able to talk to them, even if it's just for a 5-minute chat, you know? That communication, talking, is essential. And moving on to the purple. The main thing is, she's a good listener. So this is a young person now talking about the care worker who's come to see her. She's just honest. Like, people can listen to what you're saying, but they listen to reply. They don't listen, but she really, really listens and she understands. So the difference between what we in psychology sometimes call active listening and non-active listening. So listening because you want to listen rather than just because you want to say something back to the person. And then in the red, again, talking about the care worker. She's a person, she knows me, She knows when I get stuck, when I'm waffling on with some story, and she just helps me without asking. It makes me feel like she sees me as a person, so it helps me see myself again too. So this is what brought me back to my roots. Well, let me first say, okay, we're moving into part 3, so I'm more structured in my talk than I am in my thinking out loud. So part 3, let's take all of that data and think, well, what are the ethical challenges that might exist in replacing that human interaction now with an algorithm? And the empirical data suggests that we should look at 2 things. One is the clinician-patient relationship, and the other is what we call in psychology the therapeutic alliance. So here's where I got back to my roots, because I thought, actually, this idea of talking and listening is an old story in psychology. It's what I certainly was trained in when I was doing my degree. And it's really the core, in a sense, of what we think about when we think about traditional psychotherapy. And Freud said it even. He worried about it. He said, my case studies read like short stories. This was not something he considered to be a positive thing. He thought they didn't sound scientific enough. He thought listening to people's stories and reading them back to those people and creating his clinical case studies, which are fabulous to read, wasn't science. And people in his day actually agreed that he wasn't scientific enough. But of course, they are essential to what we heard from the young people who are in this program. The ability to tell my story to you who are listening to me helps me recover and feel like I'm a human being again. And this is all over the ethics literature when we look at where we should go with this in bioethics. Charles Taylor, who's one of our great contemporary bioethicists, says stories are the way that human beings come to know themselves. He even creates a theory around it called expressivism. He says the individual's life is typically construed in narrative terms. So the way we know ourselves is through our stories, through our histories. The succession of self-understandings individuals adopt are part of a progressive story about the unfolding and enhancing of self-knowledge. And these narratives are not simply arbitrary, so they're not random. We don't just pick them up out of the air. They are more or less adequate, more or less truthful interpretations of who we are. So we can feel it when someone is telling a false story about themselves, and we can feel it when we're not telling the truth about ourselves. That's the idea of expressivism. We also have it in the French bioethics literature, that even more important perhaps for us in psychology and in mental health more broadly, is that telling your story of suffering and challenge is a process of making and remaking yourself. Because so much of psychological mental health breakdown is actually a disruption of self-understanding. Who am I when I am a depressed person? Why can't I be like everyone else? What happens when I have a psychosis break? What happened to the old me? So you hear this again and again when you're listening to people talk about what their psychological experience of mental health challenges is like. So for Legay, this process of telling your stories helps knit those pieces together again. So to make the most of what it means to be human, the use of logos, language and reason, the development of fellow feeling, sympathy and empathy, and the desire for self-knowledge. And then finally, Arthur Frank, who is a sociologist who's written a lot about people's experiences with cancer, but I think it's also relevant here. He argues that this is part of what makes us human, that telling your story is part of what makes us human. When we think about all of the ways in which artificial intelligence is going to replace the human, the artificial intelligence will not be able to tell a story, a history, a personal history, a narrative of self the way that human beings can tell that narrative. In part because they aren't in relationship to other human beings the way that we are. So none of us tell an individual story. We all tell a story of ourselves with others, in relationship to others. So Frank says, the self is understood as coming to be human in relation to others, and the self can only continue to be human by living for the other. So this is where morality, really, a moral practice of listening and witnessing stories, comes into play. And one of the interesting things is, again, Freud is old-fashioned for lots of us. And actually, human to human is becoming increasingly old-fashioned, as we saw in part one of the talk. But in Africa, where I do quite a lot of work these days, one of the sort of hottest ideas in CBT delivery is called the friendship bench. Has anyone ever heard of the friendship bench? So as you will know, this is the brainchild of I think he's a psychiatrist called Dixon Chibanda in Zimbabwe. And what he does is he recognized that in the African context, actually going to a mental health clinic is hugely stigmatizing. Plus, there aren't really any psychiatrists in many African settings, including in Zimbabwe. And actually, as I said earlier, smartphone delivery is much more complicated than you would think. And a lot of people don't want to use a smartphone for mental health services because that's just not what the norm is for them. And a lot of people don't actually have access to enough data to be able to download these apps. So what he did, he trained grandmothers in the community to deliver CBT on a bench in the community. And they invite people who are experiencing these mental health difficulties to come and sit on the bench with the grandmothers and experience CBT in that context. He has put it into clinical trials. It is showing effectiveness in this context. And interestingly, it's just being trialed in New York City as well. So in New York City, where you can imagine lots of people live in loneliness and desperation, they've been putting friendship benches up in communities and putting trained community members, so not grandmothers, because grandmothers are appropriate for this African context because they're seen to hold a lot of wisdom. And in the New York City context, it will be someone else. So this idea is out there. Perhaps it's something that we, in kind of trying to harness AI and the sexy new technologies, are forgetting that this kind of interaction is actually very important. So I hope I've persuaded you all that the human is really, really important in the context of digital mental health interventions. Because now I'm going to try to unpersuade you, or at least I'm going to take you through the philosophers' back and forth in thinking, what actually should we be doing here? So the argument I've been making is that current approaches to the ethics of digital mental health miss this essential component, possibly an irreplaceable component, which is core to our therapeutic understanding of what happens in the mental health encounter, and that is the human. That component is the human. And you can see this all over the place where when we're trying to think, well, what are the ethical concerns that arise with digital mental health? We talk about data privacy, we talk about data sharing, we talk about anonymity, we talk about privacy. In the National Health Service, when we rate apps, so you can go to the National Health Service website and you can find apps that are rated and considered okay to use for therapy. What you see is that the ethical concerns that they highlight are safety, data protection, security, and usability. So nothing about the human. And even the bioethics literature doesn't focus on what I've been talking about. It also focuses on privacy, data sharing, confidentiality, etc. And the literature on the therapeutic alliance in the digital mental health context focuses on measuring the therapeutic alliance. So again, not about the substantive part of what makes a therapeutic alliance, but actually, let's measure it. But as you've heard, in my view, the therapeutic encounter, at least as the way in which we conceive it historically, is a moral encounter between two human beings. And we've seen that narrative, so the storytelling, has particular moral and ethical force. And that telling one's story and being listened to is part of a recovery experience. That witnessing a story requires another human being there to hear you. And that some bioethicists would go as far as to say that this constitutes being human in a world of humans. And interestingly, Susan Lanzoni, who is somebody I did my PhD with a long time ago, has gone back and looked at the historical roots of the word empathy and found it in the German literature of aesthetic neuroscience. And empathy actually was not how we really think about it today. It was actually an aesthetic experience of being able to feel your way into an inanimate object. So it was considered to be the reason why when we see a sunrise, we feel something, or when we see somebody in pain, we have a feeling. So it was not really a cognitive process, it was more of a fully embodied process. So how is an AI going to do that? But let's really consider it now. Is human being required for digital mental health interventions? So as I said, I've expressed the therapeutic encounter here. I've described it to you as an essentially human encounter. But does that necessarily mean that it needs to be delivered by a human? And that's, of course, what we're trying to get AI to do. AI to do is to be more and more human. The other question is, should AI stand in for the human in the fully automated version? So should we have an algorithm that tries to be human? And if so, well, how human would that AI need to be? Because we all have thresholds. Being human isn't just one thing. It's not even arguably what I just spoke to you about today. There are lots of different definitions about being human. So what is the threshold for the human if we're going to have algorithms stand in for the human? And how do we measure that? How do we know that an AI is being effectively human? And then you might also say, well, perhaps human beings are required for some mental health interventions, but they aren't that important for others. So I've given you data on young people who are having distinctive experiences of feeling less than human, because that's part of what the psychosis symptomatology brings a lot of people to. ADHD kids don't talk to me about feeling less than human. So perhaps it's only those mental health disorders where there is a conflict, a moral breakdown in the feeling of being human that require human intervention. And for others, AI would do very well. We could also say, well, AI is AI. Digital mental health apps are doing what they're doing. They don't need to be human. So we might not require humanity of our digital mental health apps. We might also say that the therapeutic alliance isn't something we should even be looking for in digital mental health. It's not something we should be looking for. It's not something we should be measuring. Because digital interventions can be more purely symptom-focused. Nobody says, is the pill that you're taking for depression human? Because that's not what the pill is doing. The pill is doing something else. It's focusing on your symptoms. So maybe that's how we should think about digital mental health interventions, as doing something else. And alongside that, we might think that the clinical encounter is actually a different thing in the digital space. And because of that, we can also think that maybe AI is better at some things than humans are. We know that there are a lot of not so great human therapists. So maybe AI can provide a whole separate set of things that are good. Show up on time, not fall asleep during the therapy, not cancel appointments at the last minute. And so the question is, can we build good enough AI? And should that be good enough? Should that satisfy us? And as I said, a lot of human therapists are just good enough. Or on some days, they're just good enough. And then again, we need to ask, well, what would that good enough AI look like? What are our measures for good enough AI? And then finally, I think a very important question that I'm going to end with, but really this is where this talk goes back to the start of the talk, is if we think that good enough AI is good enough, well, who gets the good stuff? Who gets the really good stuff? And who gets the not so good stuff? And what we see, what we certainly have seen in mental health delivery in the global context, is that it's the people who can't afford the resources, who don't have access to resources, who don't have the services, who get the good enough stuff, and the rest of the people who get the really good stuff. And I don't think we want that disparity to creep back in when we move to digital mental health interventions. So I think that that is actually quite an urgent concern for all of us in the global mental health context. So thank you. Lots of people to thank for all of the work that's gone into this, the series of projects, and thank you for listening.
Eu queria só fazer um comentário antes da gente passar para as perguntas. Ela está agradecendo ali a Gabriela Pavarini, que está aqui na frente, que foi nossa aluna de graduação, turma 2005, e hoje é pós-doutoranda da Ilina na Universidade de Oxford. Então, se vocês quiserem explorar um pouquinho a Gabi depois, viu? Porque ela também é fenomenal. Tá? E nos ajudou muito com toda a visita e a vinda da Ilina para cá. Gente, nós vamos passar então para as perguntas. Vocês podem fazer as perguntas em português, porque ela está com fone de ouvido e a intérprete vai passar para o inglês para ela. Nós estamos com, eu acho que tem um microfone móvel que está aqui. E aí eu vou pedir a ajuda de alguma das meninas para me ajudar com o microfone. Perguntas? Podem fazer em inglês também. Aí vocês é que ouvem a tradução.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Hi, I think I'm going to speak in English, so desculpa aí, pessoal. I was thinking a little bit about that point that you brought up about disorders that could bring a question about our humanity and disorders that don't. And that started getting me thinking a bit about what in mental health is because of our body and what is because of culture.
Sorry, just repeat the last thing you said. What in mental health will...
What in mental health is because of our bodies, and a lot of mental health disorders, scientists say that they have to do with different configurations of our brain, or our hormones have some kind of fluctuation that most people don't have, and what is because of culture. I was thinking that I feel that a lot of that thing where people with psychosis are seen as inhuman or crazy comes from labels that society puts on them. Their behavior is so different that we see that as fundamentally different from everybody else in a humanitarian way. And we don't always put that, oh, just their body is different, but they're still human. And in other countries, psychosis actually has different symptoms. And they are cured much faster. They have a totally different symptomatology that isn't seen as a different human being or as not being human. So I started thinking a lot about that, and then what can digital things bring to that? If digital things are like a pill, but they don't work with our bodies, and how that all plays out.
Yeah.
It's kind of a confusing question.
Yeah. No, I think these are excellent points. You know, what you're talking about is a cultural sensitivity, which in psychiatry, in the global context, we often don't have. And the worry is that digital mental health will do the same sorts of things that, you know, the psychiatric manuals such as DSM or ICD do, which is see people as a list of symptoms that fit particular diagnoses and not take into account culture and the way bodies exist in culture. And so I think what we need to do is we need to keep making that point. We need to keep saying, particularly if you're going to go the route that digital is more like a tablet, you know, that we need to keep making the point that that actually is a different kind of injustice if we're going to then be labeling people with diagnoses that don't fit experience. Your colleagues asking questions.
Vou tentar fazer pergunta em português. Eu estou trabalhando num projeto também de apoio via internet. E a gente acabou pensando no material como e-book, né? Como um material mais interativo, com possibilidade de vídeos, com possibilidade de atividades registrados. Então, como se fosse um livro mais moderno. Que a gente tem autoajuda via livros faz muito tempo para as pessoas que podem ler. E que isso talvez seja um componente interessante, porque nem sempre a gente quer se expor mesmo. Pode ser realmente estigmatizante, até para nós mesmos, né? Então, uma quebra de identidade. E que às vezes você pode resolver uma parte dos seus problemas, às vezes todos, dessa forma. E que isso, de certa forma, preserva a sua dignidade ao mesmo tempo, entendeu? Sua privacidade sobre seus problemas é uma opção de solução desses problemas. Mas o que eu vejo de limitação disso? Que acho que, ok, desse lado. Mas, por outro lado, eu acho que o livro... E eu acho que esses aplicativos também, talvez não aprendem. É nosso inteligente expresso no algoritmo. Nossa inteligência naquele momento que foi criado. E o ser humano, quando está escutando, ele sempre vai além. Então, ele aprende, ele aplica as estratégias de atendimento, mas ele inventa novas. A gente não para no tempo. Na psicologia, nenhuma outra profissão também não, né? E que isso seria grande desvantagem, que acaba barateando esse tipo de atendimento, a menos que seja sempre atualizado. Mas como que vai ser atualizado se ninguém mais pratica, né? Então, esse atendimento de boa qualidade é totalmente essencial para manter a atualização do atendimento de mais além, né? De perguntar, de questionar, de encontrar coisas novas. O que você me disse sobre isso?
So, are you imagining? Nope, sorry. Are you imagining a service where you're using like your ebook alongside a human person?
O programa que estamos avaliando é 100 pessoas. Então, foi uma grande questão ética nossa se a gente trabalhar com isso ou não. E o argumento foi exatamente o que você fala. Expande para uma população que não tem acesso. Uma coisa que outras pessoas, poucos têm, aí você multiplica, oferece para muitas pessoas, até em lugares remotos, com pouco dinheiro, todos esses... Eu não sei quanto que é pouco se você tem acesso à internet, mas smartphone, né? A gente tem pessoas, muitas pessoas que nem vocês. Então, mas é isso. Eu acho que você comentou de remédio, né? Tomar um remédio. Eu acho que para mim vai um pouco além de remédio, até porque não tão física, é mais informacional, dá instruções do que a gente consegue transmitir. Mas eu vejo com grande limitação é que ele não cresce, ele não atualiza sozinho, né? A menos que você tenha pessoas que continuam atendendo, pessoas vivas, né, para descobrir as limitações daquele método e atualizam também, então, a parte online.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think, again, I mean, you're pointing to the complexities of trying to put these systems in place, and also, in a sense, to the limitations, as you say, about the contemporary world of what we can do digitally. So maybe the best way to give a partial answer to your question is to say that in Oxford we had a colleague who was working on an online eating disorder, CBT for eating disorders. And he was actually working on an algorithm that would learn, that would personalize itself to the user with successive interactions. And behind that algorithm was a whole team of people who were doing what you say, which is continually updating the information, the algorithm, trying to get the technology to move along during the interactions with the person. The problem, of course, is it's hugely expensive. And it requires, in a way, more people than the people required to sit in a clinical setting waiting for somebody to come for treatment. So in the end, we may not be managing to make things cheaper, faster, more effective, because it requires so much infrastructure for these algorithms to keep, if we want them to learn, to keep learning. And of course, as you also point out, if they don't learn, then the possibility of them doing harm grows. So the harm calculation and the learning calculation have to be going in together. Otherwise, we will run into difficulties.
Oi, vou falar em português, é mais fácil. Boa tarde, boa tarde. Eu venho, há aproximadamente 2 anos, eu venho fazendo assessoria com profissionais da área de computação, de inteligência artificial, para trabalhar em aplicativos, mas no caso específico para detecção de indicativos de depressão ou ideação suicida, não necessariamente isso daí, né? E eu consigo, assim, eu super me relacionei com as questões éticas que você colocou, porque é algo que a gente vem colocando desde quando eles nos procuraram aqui. Eles são colegas de uma outra universidade, também aqui de São Carlos, que a USP basicamente trabalham só profissionais de computação, né? E pensando no Early Intervention in Psychosis, eu fiquei imaginando o salto. Eu já tive muita dificuldade em imaginar. O que a gente está fazendo agora, basicamente, é trabalhar em algoritmo de identificação de emojis, postagens de do Reddit, de postagem do Facebook, do Instagram, e emojis que, de alguma forma, a gente começa a identificar com alguns instrumentos de depressão e de ansiedade, alguns elementos que tem um algoritmo que aproxima. A gente já chegou, pelo menos, no sentido de ter um alerta de que aquela pessoa está num momento crítico com relação à ideação suicida ou da depressão, não é? Mas, nesse caso específico, as pessoas com quem a gente está fazendo autorizou você entrar na rede e manter esse link, né? E a ideia é o aplicativo, está sendo desenvolvido o aplicativo que vai ficar lá no seu celular fazendo esse rastreamento das postagens, né? O grande desafio que eu acho é isso. Uma vez que você tem o alerta, eu até consigo imaginar, né, a questão do alerta e de avançar no algoritmo, no caso do suicídio, né, da ideação suicídio, da depressão, avançar, porque a gente tem, de fato, encontrado dados muito interessantes. Acabamos de ganhar um prêmio agora, com os dados que a gente obteve, e ficou bastante interessante. Mas eu confesso para você que a tua discussão me fala muito pessoalmente, porque uma vez que nós tivermos esses rastreadores, esses indicadores, como é que você vai estabelecer o cuidado da saúde? Porque esse lado de receber a informação e cuidar, eu não consigo imaginar ficar por conta do algoritmo. E esse é um impasse que a gente tem dentro da equipe. E isso que você falou agora é muito verdadeiro. Quer dizer, cada vez que a gente pensa, por exemplo, dado alerta, ter uma central que vai receber e vai orientar. Mas você precisa de muita gente para isso. Você precisa de gente para receber. Você precisa de informações da região para encaminhar. Então, assim, eu acho, mas ainda acho mais tranquilo pensar no app para depressão e para suicídio do que para psicose, não é? Então, assim, você, o que você acha? Como você vê esses aplicativos para essas outras condições?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate to the burden of responsibility, actually, and that, of course, is one. Part of what you're saying raises this really important question, which is, who is responsible for the care of these young people, and who's accountable if something goes wrong? So that's the other thing. That we really haven't sorted out. If it's an app developer who's just got an app out there and we've got young people just using the app, well, who is responsible? We have one of our colleagues on the team, Jessica Lorimer, is going to start a DPhil looking at these suicide prevention apps using social media and other data, and start talking to young people, particularly about how what are the ethics of being traced, and how would they want that communication to go? Because I think I think the technology, I like the fact that the app developers are coming to talk to you. I think that's terrific. That's exactly what should be happening. But at the end of the day, their commercial interest is in creating the app, and then they will go home. And then someone else will have to come in and think, well, what is the aftercare, in a sense? And even before that, what kind of communication do we need? Who should be told? How should they be told? I think it's great that they're teaming up with you. And hopefully over time, these are the kinds of questions about which we can get more data, particularly from young people, to know what the right thing is to do.
Eu vou tentar falar português. No caso da psicose, o aplicativo poderia ser usado por todo tipo de paciente ou jovem com qualquer tipo de psicose ou com psicoses específicas. Esse paciente tem que estar já medicado com antipsicóticos, já tem que ter um tipo de medicação para as alucinações, os delírios, os sintomas positivos, os sintomas negativos, enfim. Ou não precisa já ter medicação para acessar esse tipo de aplicativo.
So the app that we do have, so not for people with psychosis, but for people with bipolar disorder, which is one of the apps I showed you, which is the True Colors app. So that app has actually been used very successfully for the kinds of practical questions that you've brought up. Are they taking their medication? Do they need a reminder that they're taking their medication? So those kinds of active interactions have happened, and that can be automated in the app. The other thing that the True Colors people have been doing is collecting passive data. So looking at their GPS tracking, for example. Are these people, particularly those with bipolar disorder, if they go into certain environments, it could be that they're moving into a state of a high, for example, or if they're not moving around enough, it could be that they're staying in their homes and they're in a severely depressed state. And so True Colors has been picking up that kind of data and using it to get in touch before a big bipolar shift happens, to say to the person, we're recognizing, that you're going out and you're doing crazy stuff where you look like you're going to places where you're spending a lot of money, or you're staying in your room and you're not moving, so are you depressed? So I think that's a way in which that app has been very successful, and it's not, this is what I mean by maybe the app's doing different kinds of things, because that's not delivering a therapy. It's really empowering the user to be more aware of how their own habits and behaviors and cognitions are related to periods of breakdown and periods of feeling good.
Olá, Ilina, muito obrigada pela sua conferência. Quando eu vi que você era do Departamento de Neurociências e trabalhava com ferramentas digitais, eu fiquei muito curiosa de saber se teria algumas medidas neurológicas ou fisiológicas que poderiam ser utilizadas nesses aplicativos e se isso já está desenvolvido. Então, gostaria de aproveitar a sua presença aqui para perguntar como que está isso em relação a medidas fisiológicas, por exemplo, condutância da pele, ou até medidas neurológicas em termos de ativação, desativação. Desativação não, porque não existe, mas diminuição. Desculpa, Zair.
So I should say I am not a neuroscientist. I was trained as a developmental psychologist and very quickly became a bioethicist. But I can give you some information from my colleagues who are working in neurology. So two of the biomarkers for early onset dementia, and to some extent also in Parkinson's, that we see can be actually picked up on the smartphone. So one is voice register. That seems to indicate something about voice register and voice tremor. Seems to pick up something about the neurological status in Parkinson's. And people are also actually, not in my department, but in other places, trying to look at voice register as a biomarker for depression. So that's more about how your voice modulates. And apparently when you're in a depressed state, you actually sound different, and that can be picked up on your smartphone. And then the other for Parkinson's patients particularly, but again, to some extent for early onset dementia, is how you type. So with a tremor, of course, you're going to type much more slowly and you're going to make many more mistakes. But for dementia patients, particularly those who are losing some aspects of their memory, they're also making many more mistakes when they type. And so that's data that people are trying to use as a biomarker for an indication of status in neurological performance.
Olá, obrigada pela sua palestra. Eu fiquei muito animada com vendo assim o uso da tecnologia para essas questões de saúde mental, mas eu fiquei com algumas preocupações também. Agora que você explicou melhor os aplicativos, acho que eu entendi um pouco melhor algumas questões que tinha ficado com dúvida, mas eu fiquei pensando se, de alguma forma, isso não poderia ser utilizado também para controlar demais as pessoas. Eu acho que o autoconhecimento é muito importante e ter uma ferramenta digital que te ajuda a saber como você está indo e a encontrar padrões, eu acho isso muito positivo. Mas eu fico pensando se isso poderia ser utilizado de alguma outra maneira. Então, por exemplo, empresas que obrigam os funcionários a usar um aplicativo desses para eles identificarem quem eles não querem lá dentro. Não sei, fiquei pensando em algumas questões que poderiam estar e queria saber se você tem alguma resposta sobre isso.
I agree. And one of the places we're seeing this happening in the UK context is in education. So there is something called AS tracking, which we've really just discovered. I don't think it's a secret, but we just discover it, that quite a lot of our private schools, so these are schools that require students to pay a fee, are also asking students to sign up to something that tracks their cognitive and behavioral state. And it requires them to input data constantly. And this is then managed by the schools, who then decide whether or not students need to be brought in for counseling or parents need to be told. And the skeptic in me thinks that the schools are more interested in how students are going to perform on the national exams, because that's how these schools get their high status, than they are in really thinking about how these students are doing. Because we know that our schools are not very good at taking care of students' mental health needs. So I think that, so certainly we're starting to see it in a school context in the UK. And employers also some employers are starting to require employees to also do the same kind of thing so that they can keep track of their cognitive and behavioral states. But it's still a choice.
Boa tarde. Começar a dar os parabéns pela apresentação, foi realmente muito boa, para a gente pensar em várias coisas. Acho que algumas perguntas que eu tinha também as pessoas já fizeram, mas eu fiquei pensando, assim, sua apresentação foi falar de coisas que são à frente ainda do nosso tempo, pensando na realidade brasileira, em termos de apps que existem para lidar com saúde mental e um passo adiante seria pensar na ética que existe por trás desse tipo de produto e tal. E eu fiquei pensando também na questão cultural, pensando assim, mesmo sendo um sucesso em termos de mostrar uma efetividade disso lá no Reino Unido, por exemplo, na realidade não está sendo pesquisado, pensando na adaptação cultural que isso pode ter no futuro, em termos de você levar isso para outros países e ver como isso vai funcionar também em outras populações. Eu já testei alguns aplicativos que existem com base em acadêmica, por exemplo, o T-Fabulous, que é um aplicativo que é feito pela Universidade de Duke para pensar nessa questão de saúde e tal, e na versão brasileira eles sugerem coisas, por exemplo, como o melhor café da manhã possível, porque é a refeição mais importante do dia, que é uma coisa completamente fora da realidade brasileira. E aí eu fico pensando como que levar isso para pensar nas questões da adaptação cultural disso após a gente passar por esse espaço de testar a efetividade, pensar nas questões éticas, como levar isso também pensando nas questões culturais que são diferentes entre diversos países.
Well, I think this is exactly why collaborations are so important, international collaborations. It's why I'm so pleased to be here and why I'm pleased to have Gabriela on my team, because there is a commitment not to think just about our own national contexts. Absolutely. I mean, we want to partner with people in other countries exactly to understand the ethics and cultural sensitivity often gets put in the same box, but it's actually not necessarily. To be culturally sensitive is important, and to be ethical is important. And so I think that the more these tools develop, we all need to be speaking to each other, really, to help us understand what will work in the Brazilian context, what will work in the UK context, and frankly also because, as I said, it's my first time in Brazil. I'm realizing what a huge country it is, and you also have geographic regions where what works in one region might not work very well in another. So we also need to think locally as well as globally about how we can do better with these apps.
Boa tarde. Eu, na verdade, sou da computação. Eu vim aqui, na verdade, nem sabendo que tinha nada a ver com inteligência artificial. Eu vim acompanhar minha namorada e acabei achando muito interessante. Inclusive, a minha pergunta é sobre essa área. Se você não souber responder, tudo bem. Dentro da computação, a gente consegue capturar aspectos humanos muito facilmente, como a partir de uma imagem a gente vê se a pessoa está triste ou feliz. E são aspectos importantes para a psicologia. Mas eu queria entender se já hoje existe algum aplicativo que, além de pegar esses aspectos, eles conseguem juntar aspectos diferentes e, com base nisso, dar algum tipo de solução, direcionamento para um paciente.
So happy, sad, I mean, the kind of emotion faces that are in psychology are being used in the app world. But tomorrow I'm actually going to show some data that suggests that it's not just a problem to use those faces, because many of them are normed on white populations, for example, but also that new data suggests that actually those emotion faces don't tell you if somebody's happy or sad. They actually tell you more about what that person wants to have happen as a consequence of them making the face. So it's disrupting our understanding of what emotion faces are. But certainly it's an easy way in an app world to get a sense of, tell me how you're feeling, click on the emotion face. So that is happening. But I suppose my point is it's not very subtle.
Acho que não temos mais perguntas, então eu queria agradecer muitíssimo a presença de vocês, agradecer muitíssimo a doutora Ilina Singh. Espero que vocês tenham aprendido tanto quanto eu. E, mais uma vez, nosso obrigado à CAPES, aos alunos que ajudaram muito. Tem uma pergunta aqui que eu não estou ouvindo. Espera aí, gente. Para vocês ficarem quietinhos aí, que a Ju, da equipe do Eduardo, quer tirar uma foto do público. Mas, enquanto ela arruma a câmera, gente, eu vou pedir uma salva de palmas para a doutora Ilina Singh. Undergraduate students. We need to go there. It's like a
aqui, ó. Então, eu tô com fichário.